Because that's the problem too, is that like on the left, the kind of left-wing people that would be perhaps most inclined to that, I still think, and not to be too much of a sort of neocon about this, I do think that there is still too much of a kind of like blame America first, America's, the root of all evil kind of mindset.
Hello and welcome to the More Freedom Foundation podcast. This is a special episode with Rob and the wonderful JJ McCullough. This is a two-parter, so if you've missed the first part, I would recommend popping on to the episode just before this and catching up. But on with the show.
Do you think that there is, though, a general... Because, I'm trying to think, if there's a general sort of disposition that a lot of Vietnam vets have in terms of U.S. foreign policy. Because we could say, as we said at the beginning, a lot of the World War II generation vets, their lesson from the conflict is that there must never be another world war. That was the single guiding principle of their foreign policy sort of agenda, and was a broad consensus that seems like it was shared. Obviously, there were some wacko outlier, Jack the T. Ripper types who sort of dreamed of World War III. But, you would sort of say that the broad sort of middle sort of establishment opinion was that lesson of being a World War II veteran is never again, right? But can we generalize the Vietnam vet kind of community in any sort of way? Other than John McCain, are there I guess there was there was the other Senator Kerry, not John Kerry, but Bob Kerry. I don't know much about him.
Bob Kerry, was he famous for war crimes?
Yeah, but I don't know much about his foreign policy or how he was informed by any of that.
I think that regardless, the men who fought in Vietnam were a subset of the baby boomer generation, a larger subset than are perhaps depicted. And I actually had a really depressing conversation sort of walking around New York City, and it was sort of like the stereotype of the homeless person in the 1980s was a Vietnam veteran. And it's like, oh, yeah, all the sort of stereotypical Vietnam veteran, living rough people of our youth, they're dead now. It was, I think, of the population that went to fight in Vietnam, it was a very damaging experience, and it was a smaller subset, and a lot of them didn't end up having a large impact on politics going forward. I think we're kind of seeing a horrifying example of that now with the veterans of the war of our youth, the Gulf War in Iraq and Afghanistan, where vastly larger numbers than actually died in those conflicts have been taking themselves out, have been killing themselves. So yeah, I think there's many exceptions to that. I have great friends who fought in those conflicts who seem perfectly well adjusted and some of them are putting themselves in a position to eventually be policymakers. But I do think that it's hard for me to think of what would be the general Vietnam veteran political position.
Yeah, well, and maybe you're right. Maybe they just weren't that politically consequential. It's not at all impossible. We can sometimes search for these kinds of things in vain, and they're just the sample size is too small to sort of draw big conclusions. It does sort of invite an interesting question, though. Now, I suppose when we think of the veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan, who are starting to become more sort of politically visible, and there's quite a few in Congress now, and you sort of wonder, do they have a kind of coherent ideology, or are they a kind of a cohort that's pushing for any sort of specific kind of foreign policy agenda? And again, I don't know, I haven't sort of researched this closely enough, but my first glance is that they seem like a pretty diverse kind of crew. And certainly, Republicans are very keen to use... this is something that's quite interesting as well, was that in the Second World War generation had a certain modesty of what it meant to be a veteran, in part because that experience was sort of so broadly shared. And there has been a lot of talk in sort of American political cultural commentary about how the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War kind of changed the concept of veteran and introduced a kind of new concept of veteran, in a very hyper sort of valorized kind of capacity, in a way that was then sometimes used as a kind of propaganda sort of tool in order to sort of boost support for the then ongoing wars, right? That by sort of showing a kind of often very exaggerated, very sort of theatrical veneration for the veterans, we are then sort of showing our support for the wars itself. And it's you support our troops, support the wars, that these two causes were intertwined in a way that felt, kind of novel. And so I don't know, like it seems like there was probably some veterans of those wars who kind of like took that kind of thing to heart and, now sort of present themselves as real foreign policy hawks because they view that as being sort of contiguous with their wartime service and their sort of strong sort of support of those wars. But then I imagine that there's others as well that feel very disillusioned by that and view their service as a symbol of a kind of failure of U.S. foreign policy, that they now consider themselves to have insight that they will bring to government and, advocate for, foreign policy that's very much the opposite of the sort of thinking that led to the wars that they fought in. So I don't know what your sense is.
Well, that's a fascinating dynamic. I think we can say with great confidence that the foreign policy establishment, the broader upper echelons of the Pentagon, did not learn the important lessons from Vietnam about, just not getting involved in stuff like that. But the Pentagon learned an extraordinary amount about media management from the Vietnam War. What was so stunning about the Vietnam War was that journalists were sort of, hopping on helicopters, getting extremely raw footage of really horrible stuff and pumping it directly into people's living rooms. That was like a dynamic of the Vietnam War that at the advent of the War on Terror, the Pentagon made damn certain would never happen. This sort of policy of having carefully approved and vetted embedded journalists, with a bureaucracy around that. And I don't think going quite so far as censoring what those journalists were putting forward, but producing an environment such that, so I think it was just very carefully, certainly in anti-Vietnam War agitation, a quite cruel, I think, demonization of the U.S. soldiers who were victimized, really, by having to go there, was certainly a dynamic, whereas anti-Iraq and Afghanistan war stuff sort of always had to be couched in a sort of, as you said, sort of quasi-worshipful way of talking about the troops. Even myself, I'm pretty scathing about U.S. military and foreign policy choices, but even I, as just a reflex, am always doing that in the context of being quite worshipful about the troops. And I think a lot of that is better. I think it's pretty screwed up that very damaged, often quite economically disadvantaged U.S. soldiers coming back from Vietnam were demonized, and I think that's pretty messed up. But I think we definitely take it too far. I am somebody who lived abroad for 5 or 6 years. I have gotten to know a lot of people who lived abroad under the auspices of the Pentagon, guys who served abroad. Great guys, more heroic than I could imagine. I'd never do it myself. But I've been really struck by how little they've been struck, actually, in conversations we have, just how little they actually knew about the regions they fought in. How little, if you go to one of these countries and you live on a U.S. base in a U.S. context, and everything you get of that culture is mediated through an interpreter, and you're never going anywhere without a gun and a whole bunch of your buddies with guns, you're going to get a very distinct, and not everybody's like this, but most veterans that I've spoken to have gotten an incredibly limited sense of what was going on in these countries. And it can be quite unfortunate, actually, the extent to which with some, I've seen it sort of helps them trend towards a knee-jerk, these people are all savages, they deserve whatever we do to them, whatever happens to them. Actually, these countries, this culture, this religion are just fundamentally worthless, and sometimes that can have a salutary effect where it's just we don't belong there. But I'd say often there's a flip side to that, which is they are subhuman and we can do whatever we want to them. And I think I don't know. I don't know what your take is on it, but certainly since October 7th, the conflict in Gaza, I've been really, really appalled at just the level of dehumanization of Palestinians that has been just accepted and just normal and just fine. And I think, unfortunately, some of that, by no means all, but you get some of that from certain veterans in Congress, and that is really dispiriting, because you'd hope that at least spending this time abroad would have given them it absolutely did give them a broader sense of the world than most Americans have, but I'm not sure it's like the healthiest impression.
Well, it definitely it feels like sort of October 7th in the aftermath of it was kind of, I don't know if it's the last hurrah, but it was certainly a kind of revival of a certain war on terror era kind of rhetoric about sort of the Middle East and Muslims in particular. Something that you sort of thought was perhaps a little bit sort of dormant, but has now sort of flared up. Although, I don't know how broadly sort of resonant this kind of stuff is. I mean, I think that obviously there was tremendous sort of sympathy for the Israelis in sort of the short term, but I think sort of like the frankly, somewhat repulsive nature of the Netanyahu government has made it very difficult for this to sort of resonate, I think, broadly. And I think a lot of, frankly, a lot of American Jews, I think, feel this as well, where it's like there's a desire to be sympathetic for the victims of October, but not, like, it's difficult to transfer that into like the kind of sort of support for Israel that had previously been sort of taken for granted as being a sort of natural, a sort of natural reflex among sort of Americans themselves. I think the conflict feels as exotic as it ever has, and feels as alienating as it ever has. And I do very much wonder if as because I've been to Israel, I spoke to Israelis, I kind of got to see what sort of are the sort of domestic sort of tensions and concerns there. And, you talk to sort of secular middle-class Israelis, and they're very worried that their country is just drifting more and more right-wing, more and more fundamentalist, and that the government is just going to become less and less sympathetic in the eyes of anybody except for the most committed, dogmatic partisans of Israel, which abroad in America seem like it's increasingly just getting more and more resigned to just, these very sort of fundamentalist evangelical Christians that have this kind of, apocalyptic kind of understanding of Middle Eastern politics, and their sort of views on it are all religiously inspired and all that. And so, yeah, you kind of have to wonder if sort of going forward, if I don't know, like if you're just like the next 30 years, say, are going to be defined by a fundamentally different sort of relationship with Israel and a different sort of understanding of Israel. I've heard people sort of say that like the Democratic Party at the very least is kind of, really sort of hanging by a thread in terms of how much. And again, this goes back to sort of the newfound fusion of domestic politics and foreign policy. Like, you really get a sense, you even see this at the Democratic convention, which is taking place as we record this, that like there's a conscious sort of sense that the Democratic Party really has to kind of like walk a fine line on this, because so much of the base is just as anti-Israel as they've ever been. And, and then meanwhile, like, the Republican Party is, like I said, just getting more and more defined by, I think, its most extreme sort of religious wing, which is unto itself, I think, an increasingly like faction of the party itself that, you have to wonder how long that's going to be sustainable for. So I don't know. I wouldn't be surprised if, the next 30 years, if one of the defining themes, if I'm making a video on the third 30 or whatever I call it, 2025 to 2057, I wouldn't be surprised if, like, when we reflect back on that, one of the big sort of themes of American foreign policy during that time is just a fundamentally different relationship with Israel. I mean, you might be a little more cynical than me as far as that goes. I don't know if you're of the opinion that, like, nothing will sort of dislodge Israel from the American orbit. There's just too much sort of invested in that relationship. And
well, I think there's no question that it's in the process of being dislodged. But from my perspective, which has gone from quite raging Zionist in my youth to I'm not quite to the point of Palestine bumper stickers, but I'm getting pretty close at this point. From my perspective, it's not happening fast enough, but it is indisputably happening. You mentioned it's sort of like kind of a last hurrah for the war on terror synthesis, I guess.
Yes.
And I think that like November and December really felt like 2003 again. Like it felt like the rampage to war in Iraq, a lot of discarded figures, even on the right, were sort of like, it's, we're back, baby, all the anti-Islam stuff was trotted out again. But I do think that just the scale of the horror, especially after there was this brief ceasefire where Israel got like 100 hostages back, and then all of a sudden, like, no, we just got to keep warring. And I think that what it's actually doing, or what I hope it's doing, is it's sort of breaking a sort of conflation that I've definitely fell victim to and was a big believer in, that I think was inaccurate. This idea that we've been mired in from 2001, that somehow these two things were the same thing, that like the Saudi Al-Qaeda attack on the United States in 9/11 was the same thing as the Palestinian resistance against Israel. And I think bipartisan, really for decades, those two things have been directly linked because, supposedly Islam is on the other side in both things. And I think that in November, December was like in as full flourish as it's ever been. But I think the truly horrific actions of the Israeli government, now rounding a year, are probably going to end up breaking that. The Israeli government for 20 years now for 23 years, has had a tremendous blank check for a lot of reasons. But I think a really underemphasized aspect of that blank check is the broad sense in a swath of the American people and the American political establishment is that like there are allies fighting against these Muslim extremists. And that's not, to some extent, that is one way that you could describe what is happening between Hamas and Israel, but that is like not most of what's happening between Hamas and Israel, or Gaza and Israel, or the Palestinians and Israel. And I think that we're probably at a point where that is breaking. But we've seen this week just how dispiritingly slow that process can be. We've had the Democratic National Convention, and the platform came out, and it was essentially the Democrats blindly asserting we are ironclad support for Israel. Da, da, da. And like I think there are a lot of leftists who are very angry about that right now, and I don't think that's quite as grim as it's being described. But it's going to be a longer path than many might think. It's going to take a while. I think it's going to be a process that plays out over the course of the Harris presidency. It actually might go a lot quicker. I am not some kind of accelerationist who thinks it's a good idea if Donald Trump gets elected. If Donald Trump gets elected, it's going to be fascinating watching how quickly the Democrats will wake up to a genocide that's happening when they're not responsible for it. I think that is possible. It's not worth it to get that potentially happy result with Trump as president. But I think you're probably right that there could be like that could be a facet of the next 30 years is the Middle East becoming an actual subject of partisan contention, whereas it used to be sort of a very bipartisan thing in the United States. But it's going to take a little while to get there, I think.
Well, it's interesting to think of how many, like, just to continue this sort of sort of thesis, like just how many foreign policy sort of conflicts and decisions and so forth will increasingly be framed as partisan ones, right? Like your position on China, your position on Russia, your position on Israel, your position on wherever else. Like it's all going to become bound up in the partisan political process, much more so than we've seen in the past. And I think that sort of, it also depends, I think, on the caliber of sort of people that are president and the degree to which they're interested in having a foreign policy that, just panders to their base, as opposed to a foreign policy that is actually displays some sort of sense of leadership. But again, that also sort of presumes that these presidents or the people around them are capable of thinking in a kind of like grander, big picture kind of way, and that they actually have aspirations beyond just kind of being on a sort of partisan autopilot or sort of lapsing into the muscle memory of the past. And I don't know. I definitely don't think we're there now, and which makes me think that probably for the next little while, foreign policy is going to become much, much more of an extension of domestic policy, with people's positions on it just dictated by the degree to which these sort of things can become extensions of things they care about at home, whether that's Christianity or whether that's culture war stuff or whatever else.
I definitely see that happening, but it's the way that it's happening is kind of frustrating. I could be dreaming the way a lot of ideologically motivated people are, but like I do think if there really was like one of these parties adopted a down the line, like we should just be doing less stuff abroad. Like let's help the Ukrainians get a deal, but let's get them a deal, and we're like sorry.
Like no, I was just gonna say, like, if I can cut you off though, Robert, but I think that like the problem is that even sort of like once you even start to articulate that in my mind, that's already sort of becoming right-wing coded, because the way that kind of thing manifests now is like through the kind of like the Tucker Carlson kind of set, where it's like, it's not from a kind of like high-minded place of geopolitical sort of sanity. It's more, and from like a kind of like the rest of the world, like, I just don't care about foreigners. Foreigners suck. I hate them. They're dumb. They're taking our money, that kind of thing, right? So it's like the real challenge is to be able to sort of like articulate that kind of sensible sort of foreign policy agenda, but in a way that doesn't read as just hostile to the earth or indifferent to the rest of the people on it, right? And I think that actually that's sort of something that I find a little bit refreshing about some of your hot takes on foreign policy, is because you do seem like sincerely interested in the well-being of people outside of America. And that is just unto itself just such a rare disposition for like kind of people on the sort of isolationism curious, if we could call it that, kind of end of the spectrum, right? And I don't know why that's not more possible, but I guess it's not more possible just because there's not a domestic sort of constituency for it. Like and because that's the problem too, is that like on the left, the kind of left-wing people that would be perhaps most inclined to that, I still think, and not to be too much of a sort of neocon about this, I do think that there is still too much of a kind of like blame America first, America's, the root of all evil kind of mindset, with some of the sort of people on the left who you might otherwise sort of expect to be sort of open-minded about that kind of position.
I mean, I go in a different, I don't think the America is the root of all evil. I think America is the root of all.
Yes.
Like, period. Like,
yes.
I don't think that independent nation states exist to the extent that most U.S. North American discourse pretends they do. I think you think of sovereignty as like a bundle of sticks and a bundle of abilities to do things, powers, sort of a list of powers. And I think China has the largest bundle of sticks of sovereignty, other than the United States. Maybe India is a little bit below that, but like really no country other than the United States, in my mind, is truly sovereign in the system that we exist in now. So I think my like sense of blaming America for everything actually comes with like a pretty strong sense of responsibility. Like I'm not someone who's like, oh, we just do the evil things. No, like we do all of the things. Like the economic rises of any country that's done well in the 20th century are inextricable from U.S. economic stories. What I find, and I find not enough people are talking about, what I find so horrifying about what's happening in Gaza right now is that it represents a very real U.S. abandonment of something that was always to some degree hypocritical, but like a really wholesale U.S. abandonment of the human rights architecture that never existed in geopolitics before the United States started enforcing it in the aftermath of World War II. Like, that's why I find Gaza so incredibly horrific, is that it exposes the United States' complete hypocrisy. Like, I think that, like, Russia is doing horrible things in Ukraine, and I think that China's doing horrible things in Xinjiang that should be called out, maybe called genocide, depending on your definition. But what the United States is doing in Gaza is so much worse. And, like, as much as sad as that is for the Palestinians, I think what's from my perspective, my selfish perspective, is even sadder, is it's the United States sort of throwing away a really good tool of empire management. And also human rights are good, generally, that's like a good thing. So like, I think leftists definitely go too much into the, America is bad and evil. One of the funnier things, leftists, have you ever heard of this book?
Palo Alto? No.
I just did a review of it in a podcast that's upcoming, probably after this one. And I don't want to pick on this guy too much, but he's a stridently left-wing guy talking about Silicon Valley and Stanford University and its role in all kinds of things. And what's fascinating about it is like he gives the Cold Warriors too much credit. Like, he talks about all of the horrible things that the U.S. Cold Warriors did in Indonesia or Central America and this kind of thing. And he's like, and that's how communism was defeated. And I'm like, no, that's not like you're giving the foreign policy monsters too much credit. Like the Soviet Union fell because oil prices got really high and then they got really low. And also it was a system that never made sense and had internal contradictions that were going to collapse. Like the fact that we murdered hundreds of thousands of people in Central America, like, wasn't that important? The fact that we didn't actually have, like, Vietnam's main function was to extend the Cold War and to give the Soviet Union a new lease on life. And it's like, it's interesting that like the leftist view, I think I'm agreeing with you in saying that like the leftist view is actually incredibly limiting because they kind of agree with a lot of Cold Warriors in saying that the Cold War was a real competition, in saying that I mean, Venezuela has definitely been destroyed by U.S. policy, but it was not going to be it was not a successful or happy place before U.S. policy made things worse. It's just this sort of, there is very little in what's happening in the world more broadly that is outside of the context of U.S. foreign policy. Is sort of an arrogant thing to say, I think. But
yeah,
I think
I guess, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's like, I guess the difference between sort of like someone who thinks the sort of things that you do and sort of like a real kind of like isolationist, sort of leftist kind of sort of anti-foreign policy, anti-U.S. foreign policy sort of leftist would be that you would believe that America can play a constructive leadership role in the world.
Absolutely.
Right? Like that America does not, like America's, like the most moral American foreign policy is not just America does nothing and America withdraws from everything and never makes any decisions again because America is sort of such a tainted, wicked place that it has moral right.
No.
So it's like you would believe that there's like there's a good form of American leadership. There's an active form of American leadership. There's a form of American leadership that's involved in these hot spots that are in the world, but in a much more sort of productive way, which I would assume in your ideal world would be a more minimalistic way, but not a kind of like, just kind of like, you know, wipe your hands and walk away kind of situation.
Well, because I think that honestly, in the lesser 30 you've talked about, we really have wiped our hands and walked away, and it's insisted that the military is the only way that we're going to interact with anything anymore. Everybody hates the United Nations, which is kind of silly because it is a organization. It couldn't be more American. It sits in New York City. We wrote all of its charter materials. And if we had put 100th of the money and resources behind manipulating the United Nations that we have put into the war on terror, God, we'd have utopia. You know, it's like the New Deal generation, the greatest generation, the guys who won World War II, really gave us an infinite toolbox, and all we've been using since the end of the Cold War is a military weapon that is now showing itself to be quite useless in Yemen and shockingly close to useless in Ukraine. In fact, we can control the world for our own benefit and for the benefit of everybody else by utilizing much neglected institutions like the State Department, the United Nations, the European Union, all of which I see as sort of manifestations of U.S. power. Like it's shocking the amount of stuff we just leave on the table. I'm not an isolationist. I just think that we have a demonstrated record of incredible failure using a military tool that should be, you know, a sword kept in its scabbard. We can do infinitely more and actually arrive at useful results by being more intelligent about the fact that, you know, we run world banking, we run world business, we run the internet, all the relevant institutions of world governance. It's amazing to me that so much in the United States is like complaining about the United Nations and the IMF and the World Bank. These are all institutions, they're based in U.S. cities, you know, like put a little more effort into it. The easiest, they're all already our hostages. And I don't mean that we need to, like, you know, do some kind of, as the mind instantly jumps to, like, so like what's the Hague Invasion Act or something, like, no, like it to be so incredibly easy to, as I think there was more of an effort put into during the Cold War, to make all of these institutions do exactly what we want, and with a sense of enlightened self-interest that is actually pretty phenomenal for the rest of the world as well. But we're just so in hock to a bunch of defense contractors who desperately want war, despite the fact that it's proven to be useless in essentially every conflict since the Korean War, and a bunch of presidents that are you know, idiotically susceptible to the, well, I gotta look tough thought process when they're paying any attention at all.
I mean, it's definitely interesting that in sort of yet another sort of extension of domestic politics into foreign policy is that the right wing, at least, seems like it's impossible to imagine a sort of Republican administration having any time for these kind of NGOs like, the UN or the World Bank or the IMF or whatever, the European Union, because sort of like in the domestic political context, these things have all become sort of bound up in, if not in outright conspiracy theories, then at least sort of like domestic ideological narratives about, pointy-headed liberal elites think they know best and da-da-da-da-da. And so there's no sort of domestic political appetite to use any of this stuff that has now all become, sort of like left-coded and sort of, like you continue to win applause lines by bragging about cutting funding to, the UN and, any sort of foreign mission abroad is like great applause line. It's just remarkable how often you see, I see this a lot, like on social media and stuff. I follow, Fox News and stuff, and I see their little posts and updates. And whenever there's any question about like budget problems or deficits or debt or whatever, everybody in the comments is just like, foreign money, paying all this money to the friggin' foreigners and foreign aid and, But
and
as long as that exists, it's like...
And it's so insane. Like Iraq and Afghanistan, so the national debt, like I'm not like a debt fundamentalist or not, but the national debt of the United States is legitimately like problematic. And like it's all vibes, it's all feelings, it's all confidence. It's not, it's clearly, it's not as important as Ross Perot was talking about in the 1990s. But at some point, these deficits will matter. And if you look at our national debt, our wars, our unsuccessful wars in Iraq and Afghanistan make up a fifth of our current national debt, which is somewhere around $30 trillion. Those two conflicts are $6 trillion of those dollars. And a small fraction of that money pointed towards diplomacy, better control or manipulation of these institutions, would create contexts where the United States simply doesn't have to get into wars. So it's an incredible investment in avoiding these trillion-dollar failed boondoggles to just put a couple $1 billion here and there into the United Nations, the IMF, and the World Bank. So it's so frustrating that, as you said, that they've become such conspiracy theory fodder. You've done a lot of great recent work on conspiracy theories. I think you're sort of the scourge. So? The scourge of conspiracy theories.
I made a video dunking on, interesting that you say this, because I would have thought that someone that sort of thinks the way that you do might be a little more open-minded about some of these conspiracy sort of things, only because, like the video, I specifically made a video on the topic of like, did conspiracy theories turn out to be true? And I find that that's a very easy sort of clickbait title. Like people are constantly writing articles, constantly making videos like top 10 craziest conspiracy theories that turned out to be true. And people like that. And I made a video saying like, no, a lot of conspiracy theories did not turn out to be true. And I got a lot of harsh backlash for positing that, because what I kind of underestimated was that there are a lot of people that think the conspiracy theorist is a somewhat noble figure in sort of American life. Right? It's like, flawed figure, yes, certainly. But it's like their willingness to kind of go against the sort of standard narratives and sort of to posit wild things that might be sort of shunned by the establishment are useful. And that, some of them, if you squint hard enough and you're really giving them the best possible faith interpretation, like, some people believe, I don't believe this, that you can find, some truth in some of their sort of crazed ramblings. And I'm not to sort of cast aspersions on you, Robert, but I would have figured that you would have maybe had a little bit of sympathy for that kind of perspective, that people that make sort of unorthodox claims of the powerful, that we should maybe give them a little bit of time. No?
None, actually. No. No, I loathe conspiracy theories, and I actually found your video very on point, because what it is they are shortcuts to avoid doing real thinking and analysis. I think that's more or less what you said in your video. It's a way to avoid actually learning anything about how the world works. Like my contention is actually like there are big lies, there are like huge things, but they're not. You don't have to like, come up with aliens or like Dick Cheney running around with C4 or anything. Like it's actually like the stuff we know is already like so much worse than the worst imaginings. I'm thinking specifically about 9/11. Like, so like when you started, like 9/11 conspiracy theories were like, I feel like, at least for the internet generation, were like the, like sort of like the Big Bang. Does that seem fair to say? Like,
Yeah.
'cause they used to be everywhere, right? Like,
Oh yeah.
everywhere. And I find like the amount of mental energy that was put into these conspiracy theories by intelligent people who, some of whom, not all of whom, some of whom seem to legitimately care about the future of the world and the country was heartbreaking to me, because you don't need to concoct some incredible story to find something to be outraged about on 9/11. It's public record that we were attacked by a bunch of people from Saudi Arabia, funded by Saudi Arabians, in service to a Saudi Arabian ideology. And then we spent the next 20 years taking out all of Saudi Arabia's enemies. That's so much worse than the idea of like some hyper competent like CIA like placing explosives to like for the benefit of Lockheed Martin or some horse. No, man, like what actually happened and what is the standard story is worse than any like loose change 9/11 garbage. But people got so far down the rabbit hole and like, what temperature does steel melt at? That like all of the people who actually, could have been leading a movement to be like, what the hell? Like, how is this acceptable? How is this something that we're going to let happen? We're just, flying off into the ether. And I think that's like, the dumber conspiracy theories really bother me because it's a way to stop learning about things. And it's a way to manufacture hopelessness, actually. Like I firmly maintain that, like, we're just a few dial, like, spins away from utopia right now. You spin the dial a couple other ways and we're all, it's nuclear annihilation, but you spin it a couple other ways and we've got 100 years of golden age, 500 years of peaceful golden age. And the conspiracy theories strike me as a way to take creative, intelligent people out of the real conversation, out of actually noticing what has really happened.
Yeah. Well, I mean, obviously, I agree completely. It's, but I mean, just to play the devil's advocate here, there are some people that make the argument, as I sort of said before, that just resisting, the quote unquote official story, like just having that disposition of skepticism is maybe useful, because it encourages people to sort of like be critical and sort of like look into things with a little bit more sort of attention and sort of scrutiny than they might otherwise want to. I mean, I tend to sort of think that, that's a sort of hugely sort of overrated and overly charitable interpretation of what is actually motivating the conspiracy theorist. I don't think the conspiracy theorist comes at it because he's like, sort of sincerely interested in finding the truth of the situation. I think that a lot of conspiracy theorists are often animated by a deep actual insecurity, often, if I can put a fine point on it, often just kind of inspired by their own ignorance and sort of stupidity, right? Which is like they feel that they're not smart enough to kind of like process the significance of some major event. So they instead sort of like try to become overnight experts in some very esoteric interpretation of that event, which they can then lord over everybody else and say, oh, you simple-minded people, I know what's really going on, and it's just some sort of bad thing. Instead of, I guess, suppose the argument that you're making is that, like, if you actually, bother to learn in any sort of substantial way about the things that are actually happening, you can accrue much more useful knowledge and sort of perhaps even if status is what you're after, maybe even get a bit of that because, you'll actually have a deal of sort of substantial insight into the situation that will make people actually respect you because you'll know what you're talking about.
It's interesting. Like, I feel like I certainly haven't gotten any status out of it, but I have gotten like a fair amount of respect from people in the countries that I cover. And it is shocking how little it takes to get comments like, I've never heard an American describe my country this well. Like, and it's like, and I get those comments and I'm incredibly grateful. And I think it seems, they're delusional. I still maintain that the countries I've made the most videos about, I don't know a thing about. But to make content that looks like it's brilliant, 2 books. Like if I read two books on a country, I'll do a better job covering it than most than any U.S. cable news. And that's what's so frustrating to me about the energy that goes into these conspiracy theories, because I actually agree with some of the devil's advocate stuff you were saying. Like, cynicism is important. Critical thinking is important. You should, and I hate the way that this phrase has been tainted, like, you should do your own research, on certain topics. Because it actually, like, especially in foreign policy, where you've got so many crowned mandarins, the wise men of foreign policy are just talking out of their ass from a perspective of complete ignorance. And if you read like 2 books on one of the countries, crucially, like books written by academics, not books written by like people from the Brookings Institution or people from Harvard, not from the Harvard Belfer Center, people from Stanford, not from the Stanford Hoover Institution, like people who are actually doing academic work rather than people who are doing ideological work for the military industrial complex, like the Hoover Institution or Belfer Center. You can actually know more. And like, I am certainly not any better connected, and I am certainly not any smarter than the vast majority of these people in the foreign policy establishment. But you can, with 2 weeks of dedication, you can know more about Iraq than most people who have been professionally experts about Iraq on CNN for 20 years. Like, it's not hard. It is not hard.
This is something that I think that you realize as you get older as well. Like, I've been fortunate in my life that I have been in sort of the proximity of sort of powerful people, and I've been in big media outlets. I've been in sort of proximity to political power at a high level. And definitely as you get older, you realize that these people are not magical people. Like, they're not a different type of person, right? Like, I think like that's the thing that you sort of, a delusion you suffer from when you're young. And I think even frankly, these conspiracy theorists kind of feed into this.
Absolutely.
This idea that when you climb high enough in the ladder of any institution in society, you somehow find like these magical people that are just different and more competent and more smart, and they're just like a different class of human being. And those are the kind of people that are making the decisions, and in some way, rightfully so. I always remember like reading this one of my favorite political writers, Hendrik Hertzberg from The New Yorker. He worked as a speechwriter for Jimmy Carter when he was a young man, and he talks in one of his memoirs about like being in the White House, and I'm talking about how there's this very common phenomenon that people that are new to the White House experience, where it's like they expect to find like the smart people at some point. Not in a conspiratorial kind of way, but it's just like there's an assumption that somewhere there are these really smart people that are making all the decisions, and you just never actually find them. And you realize that even when you're at the top, it's basically just the same kind of dummies that you see everywhere else in life. They've risen high for all sorts of different reasons. But
you mean the West Wing isn't truth? That's not how it works.
This is the thing, right?
It's
like people have a lot of reasons for getting where they are, and sometimes it is because that they're competent, but sometimes it's because they're well connected. Sometimes it's because they're just strivers and they have certain personality characteristics that make them seize opportunities more readily than other people might. But yeah, it's like at the end of the day, they're not amazing people. And like you said, like a lot of times they're even shockingly ignorant about the things that they purport to be experts on. And the sooner people realize that, the better, not only because that's a sort of way that we can feel superior to elites, but also because it makes being an elite yourself, I think, seem a little bit more achievable. And I think it's important for young people to, be ambitious, and that if we want to change the world for the better, it's important for people to realize that it's not quite as hard as it might seem from the outside.
And that's another thing that I think distinguishes me from conspiracy theorists is like it's almost never a secret plan. It's almost always greed and stupidity.
Yes.
If you find something that it's conspiracy theories give the people on top way too much credit. Way too much credit. I think.
Yes.
I'm gonna have to track down that Hertzberg the article. It sounds pretty great.
He's great.
I think as sort of perhaps as a way to close, I was like I really wanted to talk to JJ about this because you've distinguished yourselves. I think I saw you talking about this in another interview, but it's like you seem a little disillusioned with politics, and are you making a conscious move towards more culture coverage? Is that a fair way to describe it?
It's weird. I mean, I do like doing cultural analysis more. I mean, I definitely think, people like my political analysis. I've been a political commentator for, most of my professional adult life. And so obviously, like, there's a kind of market demand for my ability to talk about politics that people like for whatever reason. But I feel like I feel like there's enough of that. Like, if people want political hot takes, there's no shortage of people that are able to do it. And then sort of B, I kind of feel like that there's other needs that need to be fulfilled. And one thing that I do feel a lot is that Americans in particular, and I consider myself sort of part of American culture as a Canadian, I think it's important to have like a healthy sense of gratitude and pride and patriotism for the American civilization that we're a part of. And I do make videos that try to celebrate aspects of American culture that I think are worth expressing gratitude for, or even being like aware of, like just being aware that America is a country that has a kind of cultural identity that is informed by a lot of things that has changed and developed over time. Because I do think that American pessimism is a very dangerous thing. And I do worry a lot about sort of like what a rise in sort of unchecked American pessimism on both the right and left will entail. And I don't think it will entail good things. I think even if you have a very strong anti-interventionist kind of like attitude towards American foreign policy, I think it's also important that, as we just sort of said, I think it's important that American leadership continue to exert itself in some form or another, even if it isn't in an anti-interventionist direction. And I think that even that kind of principled leadership requires some degree of pride on the part of the American people to feel that they have a right to be leaders and that they have a responsibility to be leaders and that they have a history that, you know, is not just a history of defeat and destruction, even though that might be part of it, but they also have a, you know, like, for example, like I think that there was a lot of sort of heroism and nobility in the immediate aftermath of World War II and Americans setting up a lot of the international institutions. You know, I made a video about post-war liberalism that I'm pretty proud of, because I do think somebody like Eleanor Roosevelt was a very heroic woman in a lot of ways. And I think that her willingness to sort of articulate, you know, sort of the foundational principles of a proper sort of liberal world order in the form of the UN Declaration of Human Rights, like, I think that that's something that's heroic and that Americans should be proud of, and they should be proud of her and proud of sort of the immediate sort of post-war effort to, in a way that's sort of been forgotten now, to attempt to sort of create a sort of narrative about what the Second World War represented and why it was important to sort of embark upon a post-war era that was defined by, you know, a kind of sense of peace and cooperation among the nations of the world, and a world order defined by virtues like those articulated in the UN Declaration of Human Rights and all the rest of it. So, you know, that's one aspect of it. But I also think it's important that you know, that Americans find some degree of pride in their material wealth and the abundance of America, you know, the great American inventions and all the different things that America's contributed to the world that has made the world a better place. So I don't know. And when I make cultural videos, I feel like that's in part the ideological agenda that is animating it. And I suppose you could also say, if I was making this pitch to someone like you, Robert, I would sort of say that if Americans can find pride in sort of their domestic state, in their domestic culture, maybe that would make America a little bit less inclined to try to find meaning in overseas excursions and things like war and interventionism and so forth.
I'd agree with most of that. And I certainly don't want to lose you as a political commentator. But what I do think is interesting is your videos on the presidents were sort of historical and political, but they were also cultural. And I think specifically, there's a video I only made it halfway through with, but I just really adored, was the sort of Nixon in cartoons or something.
Oh, yeah,
like
yeah.
that.
I like that video, yeah.
That was brilliant, because it's just, you managed to sort of bring in the history and the omnipresence of names that I, you know, were very significant to me as like a kid, like Herb Block, and I'm not sure if,
Yes.
You know, Hirschfield, of course, like our,
Yes.
And it just, it was sort of resurrecting a lot of things that created a fuller picture. So it's actually like, it'd be interesting to hear if you are thinking about it as sort of an either or, but I think that like the way that your political commentary and cultural commentary is interweaving is, I think, kind of fascinating. And which actually leads me to like what I wanted to talk to you about, which is just, because you talk about the generational and like cultural aspects, and just like the advent of Kamala Harris and Tim Walz, and like how they're about the same age as Barack Obama, but Barack Obama like very much functioned in a context of earlier boomers, or even like, I don't know, what are they, the in between the great, like he was very much in an older milieu. And Kamala Harris, even though Kamala Harris and Tim Walz are like 60, they are coming with this like, like they both used cell phones and the internet in relatively young adulthood, like they are like,
yes,
of a different generation. And because we've had this weird kind of stagnation with Trump and Biden being our main political culture figures in 2016 and 2020, Hillary Clinton, 2016, 2024. And that it almost kind of feels like a dam is breaking.
Yeah.
Culturally. Like the one thing that really so last night, this is obviously recorded a week or two beforehand, I did not watch much of the DNC coverage, but I did see a clip. Did you see this of Little John announcing Georgia with his very popular song of 10 years ago, Turned Down for What? And I'm like trying to imagine, like, can you imagine like Barack Obama at his 2008 convention, like trying to put in like that recent or that fun a hip hop song? Like, of course not. He would have been like, maybe there would have been some reference to the civil rights movement that like made the rest of the older boomers feel better or something, feel good or something along those lines. And it does kind of feel like, with the brat stuff that I don't understand, like it does kind of feel like there's a dam breaking in a way that like we're going from like TV age to social media age just all at once, like in a 1 month period, like in U.S. political culture. Does that make any sense to you, or does that see?
No, and I think I've definitely felt that I've definitely felt that as well. I mean, obviously, Kamala Harris's sort of rise has been treated as a movement and perceived as a movement, and I think rightfully so. Like, we're not going back. Her slogan, it feels uniquely resonant in this particular moment, given the way in which she's sort of ascended to the Democratic leadership in the aftermath of Biden being explicitly driven out for his age. Like in it's like a completely unprecedented thing, and not only because of his age, but because of how he looked on television explicitly. So like it is in some ways like you can say it's superficial and that it is sort of a triumph of image over everything else, but it also does feel significant as a generational sort of inflection point. And actually, like I said at the beginning of this podcast, like it happens at a convenient time for me, just because it so perfectly enforces my 32-year period theory.
Exactly.
Because if Biden had gotten back in, like that would have been strange. And if Trump gets back in, I mean, we all hope he won't, but it looks increasingly less likely with every passing day. But that would have been a sort of like strange kind of thing as well. But now we're having 2025, the start of a fresh 32-year period that really does feel like it's on the brink of something new, and that people are kind of exhausted and fed up with the previous sort of reign of the boomers. And in some ways, like, it's interesting too, because Kamala Harris and Tim Walz were born in what is canonically understood to be the last year of boomerdom, which is 1964, right? And Obama was born in 1961. And Obama was in some ways like maybe a little too young for when he became president. And so what I think you often see is that when a politician comes to office, when they're a little too young, they have to really work hard to conform to, the sort of expectations. In the same way that in a previous age, women politicians had to sort of conform and be like extra tough because, they were such an outlier and that there was sort of ingrained sort of skepticism of them and so forth. But now I think like someone like Kamala Harris seems like maybe, and I mean, I don't have enough sort of data to reinforce this sweeping theory of mine, but it's like you could imagine that maybe in some ways people that are kind of on the brink of a generation are actually the most useful kind of transitionary sort of figures, because they are probably ones that have some degree of a kind of sense of themselves as somebody with a foot in both worlds, right? So that it was sort of unnatural to expect somebody like Biden to perform that role, because he was just so old and so like not even canonically a boomer. So it's like, how does he, like, obviously he doesn't feel familiar or culturally in tune with, with Gen X or millennials or something. But somebody like, as you said, like somebody like Kamala Harris, who has, like young stepchildren, who like sort of inhabited a milieu where she was probably constantly dealing with people that were quite a bit younger than herself, just because she was of this sort of like interesting generational moment.
Something that I thought of is that she, unlike Barack Obama, has dated in a world with cell phones.
Yeah,
and I think that's really key, because she's famously married to Doug Emhoff, but I think only for a decade or so. So she has dated in a world with cell phones, which is something that absolutely no president no president before can. Well, actually, Donald Trump definitely dated in the era of cell phones, but that was not it wasn't dating for marriage, I guess.
Trump is such a weird character as far as sort of like culture goes, because like in theory, yeah, he was like this first social media president, and in theory, yeah, he was like on television and was like a cultural figure. In, like The Apprentice was like on the air in the early 2000s, right? So it's like he's not just an 80s character, even though that was obviously when his reputation was built. And yet, when you look at something like the Republican National Convention, it was like, the friggin' the Hulk Hogan. And Kid Rock, even like Kid Rock feels like a very dated sort of figure now. Yeah. And it's like you see the sort of like this, I mean, and in some ways like that's kind of like what Reagan was like as well, right? Like, Reagan was a very sort of nostalgic figure, and, he would drag up like, oh, look, Sinatra loves me, or, whatever, right? And it's just so it's kind of like the last hurrah of a certain nostalgic sort of self-indulgent wallowing on the part of the boomers. And I think that Trump does embody that kind of that self-indulgence and that nostalgia and that sort of last gasp, that sort of tearing you off by the edge of your fingers from the cliff sort of side kind of vibe of that. And was, in a way that, Biden didn't. And now that Biden's gone, Trump has just inherited that mantle as like the boomer who won't leave. Right? Yeah. So no, I think it's obviously way too early to tell how any of this is going to pan out, but definitely if it, we are at the beginning of something.
It's funny, on presidential periodization, I'm definitely more in like, I guess it is kind of a left-leaning approach where it's like you have the FDR era and then Jimmy Carter is the transitional figure and then you have the Reaganites thereafter, including Obama and Clinton or whatever. And I'm very partial to that periodization. But I do think that your periodization, like the magic with which it works, because, you've got your greater 30 that are all pre-TV guys, right? Like, oh, no, sorry, you've got your... Oh, no, that doesn't work so well.
What do you mean, pre-TV?
No, because they are
they didn't
TV.
grow up with TV, but they didn't grow up with TV, right? So like their Kennedy, concept of the image is different.
But Kennedy is the first TV president. Yeah. And his win against Nixon in the debates. So actually, no, I screwed it up. I thought, but it's actually the whole 60-year thing is bookended by tremendously significant televised debates, which I think is
that's a great one.
That is kind of interesting, right? But
that is fascinating.
But it's not the middle. I think it was like Breaking Points that had made the point that it was like the Biden and the Kennedy Nixon and the Biden Trump debates are the two most significant televised debates in U.S. history.
That's wonderful. I like that. I wish I could do something with that. I wish I'd made that observation, because I mean I have made the point. I wasn't a complete Biden dead ender. But I was a little resistant to the idea of forcing him out, in part because it was on some level a little wild to me that, in the course of just 60 years, we have somehow created this new test of presidential fitness, not found anywhere in the Constitution, that says that a president has to be good at doing this tradition that we only invented like 2 generations ago, right? And like, there was a time for much of American history where it was considered somewhat untoward for a politician to even aggressively campaign for president at all. Like the presidents wouldn't give speeches. This was something that people did on their behalf. Well, they just, right? So it is in some ways
sat on their front porch and maybe answered questions once or twice.
Yes. So in some ways it is kind of an interesting reflection, I suppose, on sort of the media term that a tradition can be introduced in 1960 and then can sort of take down a president in 2024. But, and then that also just kind of like, I don't know, it invites a lot of questions about what the next 30 or 60 years will be like. Hopefully we'll live maybe not quite long enough to see the full end of it, but, a few more decades to go.
It's sort of strange calling it a new social media era when social media seems to be kind of dying in so many ways, or
that's also true. And I like the internet in general as well. Like, I'm very partial. There's a lot of sort of cultural critiques that are being made these days about the so-called dead internet theory. I'm sure you've heard of it, which is basically just, without sort of getting into too much detail, it's just that the internet is just noticeably getting a lot shittier. Like, the internet just sucks more. Like,
Cory Dr. Rose in shitification, that kind of thing.
Is that so? Okay. Yeah, but it's just kind of like the internet, like, I'm sure you remember when we were young and like using the internet for the first time, and it just seemed like a somewhat vibrant, exciting place, right? Mm-hmm. There was just a lot of diversity, if nothing else, to the experience of going online. Where it's like now, like, Google is kind of crap. Like, you just don't get Google searches are no good anymore. Everything is just Wikipedia or like, kind of like bot pages that are trying to sell you stuff and are so caked up with ads you can barely read them. Or, just kind of like the sort of like the big three social media sites, which increasingly seems like it's declining even smaller because, like you said earlier, like, nobody's using Facebook anymore. So it's like, you can look at Twitter, which is increasingly becoming slop, or Instagram, I guess, which is pretty schlocky as well, or YouTube. YouTube, I will stand by. I think YouTube still has a lot of high quality stuff on it.
Well, it's kind of you might have experienced this. There's a guy on Twitter, Tom Gara, who talks about this, and I was like, yeah, totally right. Like, have you noticed a extraordinary improvement in the quality of your YouTube comments over the past decade?
Yeah, I have. I mean, I like to think that my YouTube comments have always been pretty good because I have a pretty good audience. But no, definitely, like, it's true. Like, there was a time, and this is already sort of being kind of like forgotten, there was a time in which YouTube was considered like a broadly pretty bad website. Like, there weren't good videos, and yeah, the comments were complete garbage. And like, that's where, there used to be all these memes about like how bad comment sections are. But I definitely don't find that these days. Usually, like, unless I'm watching a real Drek video, most of the time, if I look at comments these days, not even for my own videos, but other videos too, yeah, they do seem of a much higher caliber. And I'm not quite sure why that is, but it's noticeable.
Well, I've stayed small enough that I've been falling off in recent weeks, but I still try to answer every comment. And like, yeah, back in 2015, like, especially I was making videos about Islam in 2015, like, it was a nightmare, frankly. And now it's actually, everything's civil and pleasant. Of course, I saw the flip side of that in the aftermath of October 7th. So like, whatever robot they've got that's screening comments so well now, basically, like, you can't mention Netanyahu, like, you can't mention like all kinds of stuff that you kind of need to mention to talk about Israel, Gaza, what have you, to the point where I think I got like I got a hate speech warning for commenting on my own video, which was kind of amazing. Oh, wow. There's two sides to it, but it really does seem like YouTube has figured something out. So yeah, let's have close with a big advertisement for YouTube. Everybody should go on YouTube and spend more time there.
No, YouTube is great. I have to say,
I love YouTube.
I mean, I've bounced through, like, I've had a, I haven't lived that long, but I've had a pretty diverse career. I've worked in different mediums, online, offline, print, television, all the rest of it. And YouTube is the one that I've stuck with the most. I've been doing my YouTube channel for 9 years now. It's the community of creators that I feel like I have grown to respect the most. And I'm going to stick with it for the unspecified future. So I think there's a lot of really good stuff that's being done there. And I think that it represents sort of the best of a certain kind of American entrepreneurial, creative sort of self-expression of a sort that really has never existed before. And I think, like, it's the best of what the internet has so far been able to produce for us as far as, like, media engagement and messaging and independence and all the rest of it. Not without its problems, as you said, but definitely the closest I think that we've come.
I tend to agree. It is indisputably the best job that I've ever had. And I consider it a privilege to be able to keep doing it and hope to keep doing it. And
nice.
And thank you so much for coming by. You've been a role model of sorts for me for a while, and it's a real treat for you to come by. And I know my audience will be very pleased.
Well, thank you. The pleasure was all mine, Robert.
I appreciate it. It's very kind of you.
The More Freedom Foundation is also available on YouTube and TikTok. Rob's Twitter is RobOLaw, and he's also written a book called Avoiding the British Empire: What It Was and How the US Can Do Better. And music provided by Kevin MacLeod.